Welcome to Behind the Screen, brought to you by Aethir. This podcast takes you on a journey through the intricate realms of compute, gaming, Web3, and the cloud. Hosted by the co-founder and CEO of Aethir, Mark Ryden, this series is tailored for gamers eager for the next challenge, builders shaping the new internet, and visionaries mapping out the next big thing. Dive into today's episode and uncover what lies behind the screen.
Okay, good morning, Paul, and welcome to the first episode of Aethir's Behind the Screen podcast. So Paul is currently the CRO of Aethir, where he plays an important role in driving strategic growth and building key partnerships. He's a game changer in the truest sense of the word and has been at the forefront of gaming, Web3, and the entertainment revolution for over the past 3 decades. Before joining Aethir, he was the CEO of TriggerSpot, a global games consultancy. At TriggerSpot, he collaborated with industry stalwarts such as Zynga, Disney, and 20th Century Fox. Apart from that, he was also the pioneer in introducing free-to-play business model to the US, notably with, and I might say this wrong, Sulake Harbor Hotel. Is that right, Paul?
Oh, you said it absolutely right. Yeah, Sulake. Yeah, that's great.
All right, fantastic. Well, beyond Aethir, Paul holds multiple advisory roles in the Web3 domain, contributing to brand partnerships with The Sandbox and closing deals exceeding $1 billion across mobile and tech. So, Paul, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you within Aethir. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, it's been a pleasure so far. Joined about a couple months ago, and it's been a great ride so far. I think, we're doing some great things, and we're really looking at the business from the end user. So I really appreciate that as not only a gamer, but a person who's been in the industry for a long time.
Fantastic. Well, as you've just said, you've been in the industry for a long time. So I'd love a bit of an introduction to how you got started. Would you be able to maybe walk us through your initial steps into the gaming industry and what kind of initially sparked your love of gaming?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it goes all the way back. You might not hear it in my accent now, but I was born and raised in England in the 70s, in the mid 70s. So actually, I was pretty fortunate that my father was a computer operations guy in all places in British Airways. So he actually bought me my first computers, and he was big into programming and kind of, I learned basic language, so started playing games on and I think this is very unique to Europe as opposed to the US, but yeah, the ZX, I think the ZX81 was the first computer, and then the BBC 32K. So yeah, I mean, essentially I started playing games and really kind of like, really getting a big interest in them at a very early age. So that was, always had a big imagination. I think, just playing with, the Star Wars movie was out when I was born, and 3 years later I was, 3 years after I was born, and then we just kind of like started taking on, like lots of different reading and books, and my parents were very encouraging of that. So I think I started creatively, and then started actually writing and started coding very early in BASIC, and trying to kind of like look at my own creations. What ended up happening was that I moved to the United States when I was about 14. And that love for gaming continued, through all the different consoles that were coming out at the time. The industry was evolving and changing, and it was super interesting. And I kept that love for games, but then I got into music. so I threw away the keyboard and got into the bass guitar, and I had a lot of got into the heavy metal music and was really inspired by creating, and again, that was a big thing for me. Later on, I came back to gaming, but when I started my career, I was in the music industry. I started a record label. I had big aspirations to be like the next Rick Rubin, or a Richard Branson, where he started a record label from the kind of college dorm kind of thing. So I did actually do that. I started a record label from my bedroom when I was 18, and it became this kind of prolific, extreme metal record label. And back then, a lot of people didn't look kindly to that kind of genre, but subsequently, a lot of people have come up to me, even at companies that I talk to now, that they know that label, and they were really happy that I had started that. So it ended up working out. I look at that time as my time to have learned a lot about licensing, about releasing like a SKU product, like you would in the games industry, where it was, you put a lot of product development and R&D into something, and then you launch it and release it with a big marketing and advertising campaign, and then launch it worldwide, basically. But yeah, had distribution agreements with Tower Records and the Warehouse and a lot of bigger U.S., I guess, based record stores. And yeah, it was really a bootstrapped company. Ended up doing about $5 million in run rate, which was really surprising for a heavy metal, extreme metal record label back then. But got into a lot of different areas. But gaming was always on the kind of radar there. I mean, I remember John Romero, who is a big legend in gaming. He used to write us at the record label, and we used to trade copies of our extreme metal releases for his games. And there was a lot of interesting things happening, because we were an indie music label. And when I talk to some of the luminaries now of gaming, they were starting off in the indie space. There was an indie game dev scene where they would create games later that ended up being pretty legendary. Obviously like Doom and others. But the ethos was kind of very similar. It was kind of us against the world, and there was an industry already there that was operating a certain way, and the indies were coming along and trying to disrupt things. I think what changed in that I've seen was a big disruption, I would say, in the year 2000 or 99 with Napster. And then that's when I realized that, music was really vulnerable and susceptible to forces that were kind of beyond my control as a business person. And Mark, I've heard you talk about all the different businesses that you've run. When it comes to like the challenges that are external, that are so kind of disruptive, it's very difficult. You either have to jump on board early. In some cases, the older, I would say, for lack of the better word, because I'm an older executive now, come kicking and screaming into what's going to be the disruption. So it's almost like, everything was great in the music industry, everybody's having a good time, and the model was really perfect. But obviously things changed. But I did see that twice or three times in life where disruption like that completely changed the industry. For music, I would say at that point, Napster kind of revolutionized the way that people would share and community build. And then later, obviously, Steve Jobs, we can credit him for iTunes and really putting a digital model around that. And so what ended up happening at the same time was this disruption was kind of quietly happening behind the scenes in gaming too. And so I kind of jumped over to digital media and games at the time, working for a company called Sulake back in 2004 that had a virtual world. I put the label on ice because I didn't know if I could ever resurrect this record label I'd been doing for a long time. And got kind of fascinated with the idea of the free-to-play model. And that was another disruption in gaming. We were going from very expensive consoles and the console market in the U.S. where people were buying, a $400 console and games to go along with that. And what was happening in markets like Korea and China was just a completely different way, as it always has been, with people accessing not only the internet, accessing games, how they were playing together, doing these awesome LAN parties and doing them in internet cafes. Now, if you were born and raised in the U.S., I was obviously born and raised in England, came to the U.S. and then had kind of like, from the music industry, just a ton of bands and people that I had signed, and I'd traveled a lot. So I'd seen, what was happening. But I think if you had just stayed here the whole time, you really had a really linear path to the way that you played a certain game. And it was really, the publishers and the technology that was kind of keeping you there. And I think with Asia and what was happening with free-to-play was so interesting at the time and was so disruptive. And because I'd already been kind of shooken out of a disruption the first time, I figured, like, okay, let's ride this wave now, because I think that, this one could really shake things up in an even bigger way. And that ended up happening. I mean, when you look at, the first kind of, I guess, community-based virtual world that I launched in the U.S. with Habbo, that was back in 2004. The bigger one out there was Nexon's MapleStory, and Min Kim, who ran that company in the U.S., ended up being a great friend. But really, it was about, for the first time, kind of changing the way that people were accessing games. So I think the bigger publishers at the time, we can name names, it's fine, like EA and Activision and others, who really, had built a great business on this kind of, console model with buying, with basically what I was doing in the music industry, which is, sending a SKU product to a store and distributing that and then getting paid on that, but by really marketing to the end user to go pick that up at a store and play it, with no real kind of updates to that. All of that was starting to change, So I thought, this could be something. It was. I actually connected with the company through through the music industry folks. I'd signed a lot of Finnish bands. I'd signed a lot of Swedish bands, and they had told the company about this crazy guy that had put their records out, and so I think they trusted me in order to launch that business, and. Ended up doing great. I mean, about 4 years, I think we got to a $30 million run rate. We had to really think through performance marketing, which was early for users and players coming into a game for the first time and playing that for free, and really building the community first. And that whole acquisition, retention, engagement, and monetization model we see today in games, that was happening, back then on the web. Subsequently, you asked what my initial love for games was. It was really about discovery, and I think that's kind of, I know that we're kind of like, edging on why I would come to Aethir, but I think that's one of the biggest, most awesome reasons for being able to discover and play is really the ease of getting into something. It's really about yourself most of the time. You hear, it's very viral, and then you can kind of try something out. And if the technology's there and you're able to kind of try out a few different games and see which one you like and see which one you can get into, I think that's what kind of perpetuated this ongoing kind of love for games. But it was painful at different parts of the career because, in some cases, way back when I was launching games, it could take, an hour to download something, right? So I think, there was always a big kind of difference between the markets. And that's what I saw in the disruption in music, and then I saw it in gaming. And then luckily I didn't miss the gaming disruption, although a lot of people did or didn't see that coming in traditional gaming either. So those were my initial steps into going into first entertainment, but for some reason always sticking with it. I think I never gave up on games, and I think a lot of other folks that have been in this industry haven't either. So it's a long answer
Fantastic.
to your question.
It's a great answer and a great insight into what makes you tick. I know that I wanted to talk about your passion for music a little bit later on. Really great to hear how that intertwined with your gaming story.
Sure.
You spoke a lot about the challenges and issues that you were identifying in the music industry early on, right? And how that became quite ripe for disruption, right? And you did also mention some issues that the gaming industry had. Particularly, you mentioned, you might have to download something for an hour before you could play it. That's quite funny, or a little bit ironic, considering the package size that games are at now, right? With 100, 250 gigabyte games that, it doesn't really matter what internet connection you're on. That's going to take some time to download. But
Yeah.
tell me, what were some of the other challenges in the gaming world at this time? What were you seeing out there that kind of was really impacting maybe development or distribution? What were kind of some of the main hurdles that people needed to overcome in the industry?
Yeah, great question. I mean, server and bandwidth have always been, I think, one of the biggest hurdles. I mean, again, this was probably pre what is it, like AWS's whole business model, right? So it was more really spinning up enough bandwidth capacity and really thinking through the infrastructure piece before launching a community in a game. I think that was different back then, because now it's become almost a as you scale type of model, which wasn't really available, I think, back then. As far as kind of the challenges, I mean, user acquisition has always been a challenge, in my opinion, especially with free-to-play. That started very early on, especially with the games that we were getting from Asia and Korea. So I was fortunate enough after Sulaki, where I worked with, some of the most brilliant, I guess, Finnish executives that have now gone on to start amazing companies and or be a part of amazing companies like Rovio and Supercell and early Digital Chocolate and a bunch of others. But then at Outspark, when I moved on and I really wanted to learn more about how to do the MMO model, I was fortunate to have a great executive from Tencent on my board. And Tencent at the time, that was 2008, were looking at the US as how do we really disrupt this market, and how do we bring our free-to-play model to the US. And clearly the US execs at the time were saying we never want to sell our games for free, and so I think there was a perception type difference back then, which was really a hurdle to get over, as far as how do you make a game so engaging within the first 5 to 10 minutes that someone will spend money eventually, and how do you even sell that vision to investors and the players and everybody? So I think that was one big challenge. The second would be, the performance-based marketing model, because it was such a change from this kind of, marketing that was happening from a SKU-based level, where you kind of have to launch a product and you're doing all the marketing ahead of time, and then you just kind of launch the product and then everybody goes and buys it, to the ongoing kind of live operations model that we know today, which is really an ongoing marketing kind of basically, a completely different way of doing business, based around live events or events that are going to happen, or holidays, or anything that's really that people are used to, but incorporating all of those things within a game whose life cycle is not just the next year. So, we would have all these games that would come out, and then they'd have these huge kind of like marketing campaigns, then sell a ton and recoup all of that, and then it's done. To now, these games can last for 10 years, and we can just keep doing different small little marketing promotions to buy assets that would eventually be the same amount as what, a user would spend during the month anyway. And that was really a big change. So I think the analytics change was a big one, where we started focusing more on looking at, making it more of a performance marketing kind of business. I think in the middle of that, and where we are today, that kind of might have hurt the industry a little bit because, there was so much focus on analytics vis-a-vis creativity and kind of games in general that they just started to be looked at as, what's going to, be tested and launched within the first 30 to 60 days. And is this going to, last versus kind of what's a good game? Those are always subjective questions. And then community is a subjective question, right? I mean, you can analyze the hell out of a community, but even everybody gets it wrong for a lot of the time, right? Like you can you can see that in elections, you can see that in all the data we look at in so many different ways of how a community responds to certain things. And then there have been some backlashes, most recently in the games industry that are interesting of how communities have really shaped kind of what's going to happen. So yeah, I saw quite a lot of like a big disruption there. But I still feel from that point to this point, we haven't really kind of seen the next big disruption in free to play. And I think that that's where, if I was to say, joining a company like Aethir is interesting or has been interesting for me in my career, it's almost like, it's these kinds of disruptions that I feel that are healthy for gaming and are needed for gaming and are not there for gaming, but need to be pushed by people who really believe that, that we're kind of at a precipice. And I don't want to go to conferences and talk about, monetizing more than 4 to 6% of the user base. That's kind of the conversation we've been having for the past 18 years or 16 years, right? Like, I think now is the time to really talk about what other breakthroughs we can have as an industry, and that's more important, I think, to keep the industry going.
Absolutely. And, as you know, that's core to what Aethir exists to achieve.
Yeah.
I had a question that I wanted to kind of double click on based on something you just said, right? And this is taking a look at how content is enjoyed from a user perspective when there's a shift towards marketing for a game to be purchased versus marketing for users to continue to stay in the game, right? So free-to-play games, they have a reputation at times that they may be spammy or play to win or very kind of ad-centric and potentially don't represent maybe the best interests of the gamer. However, when you think about the marketing incentive for a game that is just fully released on day one, and as you mentioned, all of the marketing spend is done to promote that game at release, and then oftentimes that game can kind of be dropped or forgotten a little bit. Whereas the content that a user is enjoying with the free-to-play model, right, requires the developer to continually keep that experience interesting so that they maintain the gamers within that content experience over the longer term. I wonder if you had any opinion on how the two differences in kind of marketing and distribution affect the gaming experience for users.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the one thing I'll always point to is community. And community, I mean, in one way is like a bell curve where you might have the majority in the middle and then you have the outliers. And the outliers in the Twitter sphere or the X sphere nowadays get a lot of the love, so to speak, as far as our attention. But I think community management done on the level that can really listen to what the community is saying and want can really change the way that the game evolves. And I think that that's the power of free to play when it's done well. The things that you mentioned are clearly issues, right? I mean, nobody wants to release games where it's spammy but the platforms obviously try to come in and really discern and help with that, and they curate games, and they, for lack of good or bad with the developer community, they kind of pick their favorites and put them forward. I mean, Facebook was doing that early on with the Canvas model, where they stopped the spamminess over how you could do user acquisition, and then Apple now with IDFA, and then we'll see that with Google going forward, which are challenging things for game developers because they get used to a certain system of doing and releasing games. On what you're saying, I think it's better for the community to have a voice, I think, and that's the best part of this, where communities in certain games really do have enough of a voice where they can actually shape and mold how the game can look. I mean, the earliest, or not the earliest, but one of the great examples of what we were doing in Habbo was to see that community-based hangout become part of games like World of Warcraft, for example, where it was just about grinding and all the gameplay, but there was just never any place where you could like look at each other and look at what you've accomplished and hang out and meet new people. And I think having those kinds of spots within games that allow the community to really I guess manifest and become a community was super important. So I think that the traditional model, or I guess the model of where it's just released at once, probably doesn't give the community any chance to really continue to shape the game. We've also seen games that come out and then are able to benefit from this kind of long life cycle, and also are beloved. I mean, there's also the models where folks are taking or developers and publishers are taking games that breathing more life into them because there's a new team that's starting there, and then they're listening to the community in a different way. So I mean, I think having had some impact on the free-to-play model over all those years, and seeing the change there, I did always think that the community was important, but it's a delicate balance between what the developer and it's a dance, right? And then when you're so emboldened to the community, that's probably not healthy, and when you're so emboldened to the developer, it's not healthy either. So there needs to be certainly features and certain aspects of the game that are launched and cultivated based on kind of real feedback and testing. And that's another area, right? Like where, I mean, I hate to keep bringing it back to Aethir, but I really like the idea that in a streaming environment where there's no download, you can really ask users to come in and really try something quickly. And they don't have to, and you're not asking that much of them, but it's part of the community. And maybe it's in, a certain market where somebody can come in, the community can come in and say, okay, I love this feature. I love that you guys did this. And the developer can get feedback right away. So there's a lot of advantages to the technology that's probably, and the analytics. And if you look at kind of the way that the industry is maturing, I mean, this was always the problem back then, that Hollywood and music industry and everybody else thought games industry was very immature. But I think all the SDKs and all the companies that have come along, and the game engines and how we're always looking at the user experience and how that's paramount to the games industry, has shown that we've really matured as an industry. And then the eyeballs, the way that every generation from the older generation all the way down to Gen Z and Alpha are just growing up with this gaming vernacular and are comfortable in games and are connecting with people in games. So I think it's really important to continue to, to your earlier point, I think that this is why we need to continue as technologies and as an industry, continue to kind of help that process along, of people kind of being able to give us feedback loop constantly and really allow us to continue to make experiences better.
Yeah, I think that conversation with the community, between developers, between companies in general, is critical. I still remember as a student, as a kid at school, one of my favorite things was to head to the local newsagent, right, or corner store and buy a PC gaming, and it used to come with the
Yeah.
CD,
I have
right,
that
and it
because I
had
grew up in England. Same thing.
exactly, and it
Yeah.
had the demo games installed on it, and I
Yeah.
just felt like that was such a cool experience, right? You could buy that magazine, put that CD into your computer, and you didn't even really need to install the games in many cases. They were kind of installed onto the disk to a degree.
Yeah.
But you felt like you were able to kind of directly get in and test this game, and that's something that to a degree we've lost a little bit recently. So I do think back to that memory and that connection that I would kind of generate through these little experiences when I look at the impact that I hope Aethir can have to gamers, and bridging that gap and that communication distance between developers and their community.
Yeah.
Speaking of developers, indie developers have been feeling the squeeze, I think, recently, right? It hasn't been a great time for them in relation to some of the news that we've seen from Unity, and just the broader gaming market in general, I think is pretty tough for indie developers. But what's your take on maybe the impact that you see indie developers having on the gaming landscape?
Yeah, it's a
Are
great
they at the
question.
forefront?
Yeah, I mean, I really do think, and again, with the Unity runtime debacle as far as the messaging and the way it was done and the way they kind of brought that back, I mean, you can see the power the indie game developers have on the industry. I think, the company was always sensitive to indie game developers, and as we know, and I mean, I know a lot of people that actually work in Unity, and they deeply care, about game developers. So there was not, I don't think, that decision or however it was made from management or whatever, and the way it was rolled out was probably not messaged the right way and thought through the right way. But it shows the impact of the community of indie game developers, and I think that's a great thing. I mean, if you go to the IGDA meetups everywhere, and you go to certain great markets that I've been to that have a very strong indie community, like Helsinki, Finland, or now Stockholm, Sweden, and all over, even the U.S. and Seattle and down Vancouver and everywhere else. I think you really have a strong, strong development community that really cares and shares for the most part. I mean, some ecosystems share more than others. I mean, I think even Supercell, they publish their KPIs and their results, and they show other developers, kind of how they're doing certain things and who they're using and what they're doing. I think that's really healthy, because ultimately, I don't think you can really compete. I mean, you can start a game that takes away market share from another game, but you don't have the same team and you don't necessarily have the same game. So it is very difficult to, in that level, call it competitive. It's almost like how is the rising tide lifting all boats, right? And part of that comes down to the technology and the way that people are accessing the games at the end of the day. So I think that, like to your point, indies are getting really squeezed. I mean, if you look at the platform fees, if you look at kind of, the now maybe runtime fees and kind of how that's going to play out, and also user acquisition costs, which has always been the biggest issue when it comes to what's happening, and then really how to balance all those costs. I mean, we've unfortunately seen a lot of layoffs this year, and obviously, granted, we've come out of a pandemic and we're kind of post-IDFA, where the privacy issues have affected developers by not being able to really see where the traffic's coming from once they're spending money on user acquisition. But I do think that, new technologies, and again, I will bring this back to one of the big reasons for joining Aethir was, the real belief that, and I'm not saying the world without app stores, but I am saying a world without maybe download and install could really be beneficial for indie developers. I mean, when I look at the challenges that they have from a testing standpoint, or from, everything costs money. And I think just having the ability to have users come into a game very seamlessly and quickly, and try out features or try something out, or even try a game out for 10 minutes that could be a download and install later, but at least they're getting subjected to new games. That's what we're losing, and that's the unfortunate thing. I mean, that's what I don't want to see in the industry, which is that discovery mechanism that you and I loved about the CD, right, from the newsagent, because that's exactly how I would discover new games too, and I discovered some of my favorites that way, because of the fact that you have limited time, and limited time means I can't wait all this time, or if you're in a market where your device is lower end. We do know that 90% of the people that play games are on lower end devices. And so if your device is lower end and you just are waiting forever for the game to download and install, it's just not a good experience, and it's just not really, that's not kind of cultivating and making the industry better, in my opinion, because it's not giving everybody a chance. And that's, back to your point, what indie game development's about. It's like the small indie game developments should have just as much chance of getting their game featured or seen as the big incumbent, right? And what we're seeing is an imbalance of power of that right now. And that's from millions of dollars spent, or if you even look at markets like India, for example, where there's such a disparity between the top 5 games and the rest of what's in the app stores. It's a very different kind of way to look. So way to also kind of be able to reach that many people or that market. And you might have a game that is perfect for that market, for example, and the market deserves that. So I think it's taking away a little bit of friendly competition in that way. But I think the indies, they continue to have a huge voice, and also a lot of the innovations come from the indies, because they're apt to trying out new things, apt to trying out, and our game. I always say the games industry changes every 6 months in the way that, we have so many new entrants to market, or we have a new game that comes out, or we have a new way of doing things, or a different way of looking at the data. So in our in this instance, I would say that indies really can use their voice to take advantage of those kind of things, but it can be difficult, and I think technology such as Aethir and others can help in that way with the indie game development market.
Well, let's kind of dive a little bit more deeply into the technology side, and again, happy for you to talk about Aethir, but anything else that's on your radar from a technology perspective. How do you see emerging technology within the gaming industry shaping the future of gaming?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I've been in free to play a long time, so I'm obviously not obviously, but a huge fan of the blockchain and what that could have been and can be, because of the recording of transactions, the distributed ledger aspect, the ownership of digital assets. I think for me needs to be the next disruption. So as we see these new projects that have been funded, and obviously, we went through I always look at every platform has, bad actors. I mean, Facebook and everything, but at the end of the day, when we look at kind of, where we should be going as an industry, I think the democratization and the decentralization of certain aspects of it are so important to where it needs to be, and also empowering the user and the gamer with the choice and the ability. I think that, the interoperability of assets, I remember even with Sulaki Habo, and that was a great experience at the beginning of having a walled garden where we would have to cut people off and the community off for trading at eBay or doing those kind of things, right? And I so don't believe in that as an ethos because of what's happening in the global economy and how there's so many talented gamers and so many talented people in esports and other areas where, we should allow them to own their own of all that work and all those hours and all that time they put into something they love because they are so good at it, and it should be recognized in some way. And I think that these are the things that we're kind of not putting at the forefront, and we're not. And again, it is a platform issue, and it's sometimes a regulatory issue, or it's there's a lot of different issues, and but I think that ultimately, I do believe really strongly in the ability of the gamer to be able to own their digital asset, their avatar, and all these other things, and then interoperably walk between the different games and the worlds. And then, until we're at that point, because the yardstick keeps getting moved, I think there'll be, that should be frustrating for a lot of folks, because I think that could only add to a much more a much better and inclusive kind of gaming experience for so many people, where they could meet so many other gamers. But I think it's these other technologies, obviously Aethir included, that can help bridge those gaps. Based on the fact that there are gamers in other areas that just can't access or play the same game you want to, and this was all the promise of gaming and communities anyway. I mean, we have very simple platforms that allow us to connect with so many people in the world. But some people want to do that through games, and we should allow them to do that, right? So yeah, I think that's interesting. I think streaming is incredibly interesting. I think a lot of the executive peers that I talk to, the big publishers, always agree with that. It was always just a timing thing, or it was early. But blockchain, certainly streaming and being able to play a game on demand and instant play and quickly, I think, in getting into a game is very, very important. That takes away a lot of the friction, I think, that we see in user acquisition and all the marketing that we have to do ahead of time. It should be a Spotify or Netflix experience, to be honest, right? It should be just like, I can go pick up this and look at it, and then I can just say, okay, I don't like this, or I do like this, or I don't like this. And I think that these are kind of, to me, the most important disruptive technologies that are that are happening now, and need to kind of be cultivated and need to be kind of focused on in order for the gamer experience to really, get to that next level. Because I think we're still kind of in this area where, the free-to-play, for lack of a better word, Web 2 kind of experiences are still, we're still there. And I don't think that. The other ones are obviously VR and AR. I do believe really strongly, and AI, because I think an NPC that's so personalized to you in a game, where if you're not available and you're sleeping and I want Mark in the game, but there's a Mark AI there and we're walking through the game together, it's just so much, I mean, everything should be more personalized to the gamer, and without good compute, without, any of these things, I think we're missing out on the promise of where we can really take the industry. So I think we're still getting there. And that's kind of a tragic thing in 2023. I think we need to do better.
It is tragic. I mean, if you look at the other entertainment genres, right? Whether it's movies and TV or music, we've kind of done a pretty good job at removing the hardware issues restricting people accessing that content, right? We've made it a content decision. If you want to listen to music, you can make that choice, right? You don't need to have an MP3 player anymore, or a mini disc player, or a CD player, or a boombox, right? You have the ability to pretty easily, pretty universally nowadays, access music without really anything getting too much in your way. And the same goes for content, right? You don't need a DVD player anymore. You don't need a Blu-ray player. You can access pretty much any form of visual content instantly on almost any device. And gaming is really being left behind. It is not a content decision when you look at accessing games. It's a hardware decision. And this is probably the saddest part about gaming, and it's not getting any easier, right? GPU prices are more expensive now than they ever have been. The barrier to entry from a hardware perspective for a gamer to kind of jump into, particularly PC gaming, but consoles as well, it's not getting any easier, and it should be. So I totally agree. I think an environment where we can make gaming and a choice as to what game you want to play a content-based decision as opposed to a hardware-based decision is a crucial next step, particularly when we look at the number of gamers in emerging and developing markets that are online. They do have access to a smartphone, but those smartphones are limited in their capability and their computational capacity, right?
Yeah.
So how do we remove that requirement for this vast majority of gamers to own hardware and then access gaming content is, as you know, the question that we're solving here at Aethir. But to be honest, I think it's arguably the biggest question that gaming has to solve in general.
It's fantastic.
But,
I mean, if you look at
Paul,
good stuff.
sorry, not to
No.
to cut you
I was
off,
just getting
but,
excited by what you were saying. So, like all the emerging markets with all the middle class and everybody who's coming up and has the ability to access games, it's only going to get better, right? So,
absolutely. All right. Well, to end the call, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. It's been incredible getting to know a little bit more about you and your background and sharing your stories with our listeners. My final question for you is, what are your 3 top most favorite games of all time?
oh wow, that's a big one, huh? Well, I have to go back to like the favorite game that I loved when I was a kid, which is like this really kind of shitty basic, sorry for my language, called Citadel, which was on the BBC 32K, which I absolutely loved, and I played for hours and hours and hours and hours. I think of all time, it's hard, but I played so many games with people that I remember playing Terminator Salvation with my nephew for hours and hours and hours together, and I just found it to be, just teaming up and then just going on a mission, and that would be kind of like an evening thing that we would do together. It was just brilliant, So I think that that's always in there. And again, like I just love. I mean, I have a lot of favorite games, but I just remember the ones that I played. Like I play Mario Kart with my wife, and we really have a good time. And she always beats me, which is great. Good for her. She's brilliant at it. Just games that I play with other folks. Injustice is another one where all of those, for me, and I think it was that Mortal Kombat style that reminds me of when I used to play at 7-Eleven and do all that stuff against each other and being the superhero that you want to be. I think all of these experiences are absolutely fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, it and then I played Fortnite and I played a bunch of others, but I think that these are, I always think about when you ask me that question, it's always the ones where I'm smiling and laughing and playing with other people that make me always remember. So, those would be, those would be my favorites. I'd love to hear yours, by the way.
That's what's great about gaming, right?
Yeah.
It's about community. It's about connection. It's about interactivity and immersivity within that experience. And if you can bring someone along with you, all the better. My answer to that question, I got into gaming playing Doom. Right?
Oh yeah, cool.
Prince of Persia. Back when you were loading games in with a 3.5-inch kind of floppy disk.
Yeah.
And then my real obsession with gaming came kind of at the early days of Counter-Strike when it was a Half-Life mod. Really enjoyed kind of Half-Life and Counter-Strike and kind of followed that through all the way through Source. And it's exciting to see Counter-Strike 2 recently released. Have yet to play it, but really have to find the time. And then the third would be World of Warcraft. I'm a massive fantasy and science fiction nerd.
Sure.
And the fantasy side for World of Warcraft really sucked me in as a kid. So I spent far too long in that game.
Awesome.
Progressing from kind of just a total noob through to someone that was, pursuing quite a lot of end game content at one point in time. So yeah, fantastic memories. And funnily enough, I bonded with my brother a lot through our love of kind of Counter-Strike and World of Warcraft. We'd play together. He kicked my butt in both of those games. Not that I'd let him know it, but it was a fantastic memory. But Paul, thank you again for your time today. It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to the episodes we have coming up where we get to introduce people to Kyle, our CTO, and some other exciting guests that we have lined up. So thank you again, Paul, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yep, awesome. Have a good one.
This podcast is brought to you by Aethir. You've made it to the end of another epic episode of Behind the Screen. Smash that subscribe or like button, and don't forget to follow us on YouTube and Twitter for all the latest patch notes and updates. Thanks for listening.